Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's session. I'm just going to allow the rest of our attendees to join us. Give ourselves just a moment before we start here. Welcome to the Weapons of War, examining gender-based violence in conflict zones. My name is Nyeleti Honwana. I'm a program officer at the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation, and I'm incredibly pleased to welcome you to Weapons of War, Gender-Based Violence in Conflict Zones. This is the first installment of HFG's Global Perspectives on Gender-Based Violence speaker series under the umbrella of our broader Knowledge Against Violence speaker series. So the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation, for those who are unfamiliar with us, examines enduring and urgent problems of violence through basic and applied research. We aim to understand the causes, the manifestation, and control of violence, and we spread this knowledge to inform policy, practice, and public discourse, as well as to advance scholarship. So these convenings are really drawn from the Foundation's vast pool of scholars and grantees. Our speakers discuss timely research and analyses of situations of violence, including war, crime, terrorism, intimate relationships, climate instability, and political extremism. As I mentioned, this session is the first of 3 such conversations which center gender-based violence in its various forms. And while this particular conversation will focus on violence against women and girls, cisgendered women and girls, there's a plethora of research on how GBV manifests in and impacts the lives of men and boys, as well as those within the LGBTQI+ communities. And so our hope is that this informative space really leads to knowledge sharing, and we therefore encourage you all in the audience to pose questions, to raise comments, to share relevant resources. And so those questions, we ask that you put those in the Q&A function in this Zoom webinar, and that resources and other important points of information are left for the Zoom chat function. So before we begin, allow me to briefly introduce our speakers and go over our agenda today. We'll begin with a moderated discussion that will end at the hour. During the conversation, we encourage participants to pose questions using the Q&A function, as I mentioned, and we'll then use the chat function to share speaker bios and other information during the course of the discussion. Following this moderated discussion, the speakers will have a further 30 minutes to respond to the questions and to engage with you, our audience. This discussion is being recorded and it will be made available on hfg.org. So as they've now turned on their cameras, I'd like to just briefly introduce each of our speakers. Dr. Abby Cordova is an associate professor at the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame. She's the director of the recently funded Research Policy and Practice Lab on Justice and Violence Against Women, sponsored by the Keough Institute for International Studies. She is also a concurrent faculty in the Political Science Department at the University of Notre Dame and the recipient of a 2022 Distinguished Scholar Award by the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation for her work on violence against women amidst organized crime and militarization in Latin America. Dr. Romina Estradi is a UKRI Future Leaders Fellow at the School of History, Religions, and Philosophies at SOAS University of London. She co-chairs the SOAS Center of World Christianity and is a research associate to the Institute of Orthodox Christian Studies in Cambridge. She has written extensively on the ethics of international development, capacity building, and community engagement, and is an author of the monograph Adapting Gender and Development to Local Religious Contexts, a Decolonial Approach to Domestic Violence in Ethiopia. She received her Harry Frank Guggenheim Research Grant, now the Distinguished Scholar Award, in 2019. So welcome to you both. Thank you for joining us on this inaugural conversation on global perspectives of gender-based violence. And I think where I'd like to begin the conversation with you both is just to give you an opportunity to further introduce yourselves, the countries and region in which you work, and what are sort of the main driving questions of your research. And maybe, Abby, let's go ahead and start with you.
Many thanks for the invitation to join this panel as part of the new speaker series of the Guggenheim Foundation on global perspectives on gender-based violence. Many thanks to everyone in the audience for being here with us. And as Nyeleti mentioned, my name is Abby Cordova. I'm originally from El Salvador. And this is important since, as you are going to learn throughout my interventions, a lot of my research is on El Salvador, but also Central American countries in a comparative perspective with other countries in Latin America. I'm an associate professor at the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame. And just recently was able to actually start directing a new research policy and practice lab on justice and violence against women that the Keough Institute for International Studies is about to launch later this month. My research relies on multidisciplinary approaches to examine the causes and consequences of inequality and marginalization, integrating topics related to violence against women, organized crime, militarization, and international migration in the Latin American context. At the heart, really, of my research is the identification of evidence-based policies and practices that can help improve the well-being of historically marginalized populations with the hope to promote democracy and human flourishing. My research, supported with the generous support by the Guggenheim Foundation, is central to the work of this new lab on violence against women at the Keough Institute, and it will be actually one of the thematic points of research for the lab in the next few years. My research agenda on the subject of violence against women and its intersections with different forms of violence examines actually four main research questions. And the first one is, what explains gender-based violence against women in criminal wars? And by criminal wars, I mean contexts where governments have turned to the militarization of public security as the main tool to address organized crime. The second question is, how do survivors respond and resist gender-based violence in this context? One of such responses, as we are aware, is international migration, but not only an exit strategy is part of the repertoire of survivors of gender and non-gender-based violence. The third question, just briefly, is, how does the population at large, meaning citizens, respond to gender-based violence in the midst of criminal wars? And what are the implications of such responses, attitudes, and behaviors for the defense of human rights in countries undergoing criminal wars? And finally, I'm interested in examining what the strategies could actually increase public condemnation of violence against women and support for security policies congruent with women's safety and the protection of human rights. So I examine these questions in the context of Central America, in particular, El Salvador, a country marked by organized crime and militarization. El Salvador security policy has actually become a role model for many political leaders across the world, despite the plenty of evidence that we have that El Salvador's, as well as other countries, a militarized approach to address organized crime has led to massive human rights violations. In the case of El Salvador, this so-called Iron Fist policy started to be implemented like almost a decade after the signature of a peace agreement. And so the Iron Fist strategy has been implemented since the early 2000s. And El Salvador is highly in the news for this model that at least in the short term, as we have seen, it has reduced homicides, and I'll talk more about the implications for lethal violence against women in the next round. But let me just say that certainly femicides continue in the country, as well as a wave of increasing violence of different nature, including sexual violence against women and girls. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Abby. Thank you for that introduction. And just from what you said, there are so many questions that are now coming to mind. But Romina, I'd like to give you an opportunity to do the same. Please introduce yourself, talk to us about the regions in which you work and what the driving questions of your research have been.
Thank you again. Thank you for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure. And I think it's much needed that we have these conversations and we share some of the research we do. So as you mentioned, Nyeleti, I sit at SOAS, I'm based at SOAS University of London. I spend most of my time really in East Africa. Positionality is also central to my work. So I'll start with my the point, the reference point, I guess, and where I start. I'm Eastern European, raised as a migrant in Greece after the fall of the Soviet Union. So I have personal experience with migration, but also domestic violence in the migration context. I have spent the past 13 years of my life in an effort to desecularize international development, but especially what we call the gender and development sector, which has been very biased towards the concept of religion. This is the concept of religion itself being a 19th century Enlightenment-based concept is understood in a very ethnocentric way. That is a problem in itself, but also because of the particular experiences of Western societies with religion in the public sphere, we have sort of shifted to a development paradigm where, well, religion, or what we perceive as religion, has been marginalized and not considered in gender-sensitive analysis. I've worked since 21 years old after doing my BA degree in the US and having spent a year as a Watson Fellow in 4 different African countries and in over 60 communities, rural and urban communities, to research gender-sensitive agricultural development. I saw that religious beliefs and normative systems are very authoritative and influential. And so that was a huge gap I saw in the international development sector. And this is really what started my career and trajectory. So I started with political science and economics and sort of conflict resolution, interstate conflict resolution in the US, as an international student on a scholarship. Then after my Watson experience, it changed my life. And I sort of decided not to go back to education because I was disillusioned with this ethnocentrism in epistemology, in the sciences in general. And I would describe myself since really as a critical activist, international development practitioner, really somewhere in the liminal space between academia, research, and international development and community engagement, really. And so for the past 13 years, in addition to raising awareness around, sort of the ethnocentric assumptions that we make when we engage with communities outside of the non-Western context, and in raising literacy around religious traditions in the context that I work in. I specialize in Eastern Orthodox Christianities, but we also work with Muslim communities, and I've conducted research with Sufi Muslim communities in West Africa in particular, and Christian Orthodox communities in Ethiopia and Eritrea, although not directly. In Eritrea because of the conflict situation that I will refer to later today, and really trying to understand how to develop gender-sensitive ways, analytical ways to understand, to analyze gender realities in these contexts, but also to design interventions to gender inequalities or gender-related issues such as domestic violence that I specialize in, or gender-based violence more generally, that are religio-culturally embedded, that do understand the nuanced normative systems that exist. Those normative systems can have negative, but they can also have positive influences, and really leveraging on the resources that exist within these societies to respond to problems and challenges and societal challenges such as domestic violence that affects us all across the world, in ways that are context-specific, contextualized, relevant to communities, and respond to their priorities and needs. And they don't feel ethnocentric or top-down or sort of these panaceas or monolithic paradigms that we're presenting as panaceas, right, through international development. In a nutshell, this is what I do. And currently, I lead a very large project in East Africa, between East Africa and Europe, the UK, primarily UK, Ethiopia, currently, because we started with Eritrea too, but due to the conflict, we weren't able to do much at this particular time. We are currently working to sort of implement not just a decolonial approach to the analysis of domestic violence and how we design responses, but also in improving the relationship between research teams in Western Europe and research teams in East Africa. So really promoting equitable partnerships to the extent that they're possible. And I can talk about the challenges there, and really promote two-way knowledge exchange between Western Europe, in this case UK, and East Africa, in this case Ethiopia, as a case study, to understand better the way domestic violence is experienced in migrant communities, including Ethiopians and Eritreans who seek a new life or a better life in the UK, to understand how the normative systems and the socialization at home influence help seeking and responses to domestic violence within the new home society, the host society, as we call. So really promoting this transboundary understanding to domestic violence and gender-based violence more broadly, moving to a paradigm where we don't look at those in isolation, but really understand the trajectories that people follow when they move across borders, and how those influence then the experience of domestic violence and responses to it. Thank you again for having me.
Thank you. Thank you for that fantastic and incredibly comprehensive overview. I would like to stick with you, Romina, for a moment, if we could, and I think go back to sort of around where you started, right? This gap that you identify, right, in the international development sector. The feminist sort of global or gender-based violence paradigm has really been at the fore of how we understand the violence perpetrated against women and girls specifically, and gender minorities more broadly. But what are the limitations that you see with that paradigm? Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes, thank you. An excellent question. Thank you, Nyeleti, for being so thoughtful. Indeed, and well, first to say, I do appreciate the critical work that feminist scholarship has contributed, and we need to be very aware of that. And I think even though it's West-centric in many ways, and I think we also have to be honest about that, it has challenged us, the women and men outside of the Western societies, sort of that epistemological framework, to look inwards and to consider our own problems from a different perspective. So I do appreciate that, and I do appreciate exchange of ideas. However, there are shortfalls, and I think, well, I've deconstructed I've sort of analyzed some of the shortfalls in my monograph, which is really a deconstruction of gender and development concepts and paradigms from in a way that evidences how these concepts are very much embedded in Western philosophical assumptions around gender construction, but also humanity and what we mean when we, how we define a human, which can differ very much across cultures and contexts, and these normative ideals and normative understandings are very important in shaping people's attitudes and understandings of gender relations, or what normative gender relations should look like, or what marriage means, or how marriage should be lived, right? And so these concepts have been very much sort of, at least in recent years, embedded in a secular philosophy of gender relations that doesn't necessarily reflect the realities and the gender configurations of other societies. It doesn't really reflect the experiences of marginalized or minoritized women, or women who, again, experience intersectional injustices and inequalities and challenges in their lives. So again, they've been, situated, right, in the epistemological locus of the philosophers and the scholars that have contributed those theoretical understandings. So my work has been, about raising awareness around the situatedness, of these concepts, and the need to really investigate how other societies conceptualize and understand whether it is gender relations, whether it is marriage, domestic violence, humanity or human well-being, or marital conflict. Because again, if we're not grounded in these society's conceptual repertoires, again, we don't understand how people rationalize their situations and how they rationalize their own attitudes and responses to issues such as domestic violence or intimate partner violence. In addition to that, most interventions have engaged primarily, again, because they take a feminist activist approach, primarily with females, because they have been disproportionately affected by intimate partner violence, one of the most prevalent forms of domestic violence. So that's very sensible, but at the same time, it has been, I would say, has marginalized systematically the male voice, and it's not all men are perpetrators. So there is space and room to understand better the male perspectives and how to engage men in responding to IPV. What differentiates abusive men from non-abusive men, for example. So that is a gap that I saw and sort of motivated me to engage both males and females in my research. And also, I would say, really interventions have been a bit superficial in the sense that most of these theoretical constructs and theories are being applied in a top-down way, as opposed to being built from the ground up, using, again, most of the theorists and most of the scholars haven't really conducted long-term community-centered ethnographic research to understand, again, how the gender ideas intersect with material realities, intersect with political realities or historical realities to shape, the experience of domestic violence or IPV or gender-based violence more generally in that context. And I think that starts with learning languages and speaking the languages as well, because without accessing the linguistic repertoires of the communities, it's important to also access the conceptual repertoires of the community. So again, one of my major critiques and contributions has been that we need to train ourselves in languages, and again, diversifying, promoting multilingualism and diversifying linguistic and conceptual repertoires, not just so as a starting point to diversifying international development responses, if that makes sense, Nyeleti.
Thanks. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that goes also to the point that you made, right, about your own positionality, right? And so I think that's incredibly important. And I'd like to actually move to Abby, because you have a really specific context with the example of El Salvador. As in one of our earlier conversations, you noted that 100 million people live in communities controlled by organized criminal groups just in Latin America and the Caribbean, right? And in your introduction, you talked about the response having been increased militarization of the state apparatus, and they're sort of seeking to regain control of those territories. How does that then manifest in terms of the threat of violence and the actual violence that is perpetrated, both from the non-state actor, right, those criminal groups, but also at the behest of the state in your context? So Abby, if you would talk a bit about that example.
Thank you so much. Yes, and so that number that you cited is actually part of the findings of scholars from the University of Chicago and others, including Andres Uribe and Benjamin Lessing, who find that up to 101 million people live in communities under criminal governance regimes, including territorial control by organized criminal organizations in Latin America and the Caribbean. So taking into account, the prevalence of territorial control and organized crime and governance by illicit groups, my book project argues and actually demonstrates empirically that when the state resorts to militarization policies as the main response to regain territorial control and confront criminal governance, the state contributes to increasing the risk of sexual violence against women and girls and sexual minorities, and also to a higher rate of intimate partner violence in those territories controlled or marked by the control of organized criminal groups. I show empirically that in territories controlled by organized criminal groups, both state and non-state armed actors actually engage in sexual violence strategically to achieve military and or profit-seeking goals. And this actually leads to survivors to living in this state of fear, and also leads them to distrust, not surprisingly, distrust governmental institutions, including the police, which, as we can imagine, actually results in even lower reporting rates to state authorities and this widespread impunity. And so the issue of impunity is core to really understand why then we see a higher incidence of intimate partner violence in these communities in the private sphere. So if there is all this impunity, not only residents there are fearing organized criminal organizations, their members, but also the police, which lead to not wanting really to talk about it. And in that, when that happens, other types of perpetrators and those at home actually feel free to engage in gender-based violence or intimate partner violence. So also, I mean, in general, a militarized approach to public security. I mean, as I was saying, we might think that is effective in the short term, like lowering homicides, as it has happened actually in many countries once iron fist policies are not only implemented, but enhanced. And we have seen this in El Salvador for sure. But it certainly doesn't stop femicides, as I was saying, and in fact increases non-lethal forms of violence against women, particularly sexual violence and intimate partner violence. And as a result of this decreased trust in government institutions, I argue and show empirically demonstrate that survivors and neighborhood residents in controlled territories actually turn to civil society organizations for help and accompaniment to resist criminal and state abuse. However, also many women, and I show this empirically, also turn to international migration when they fear gender-based violence, and this is the last resort. And so with colleagues at the University of Vanderbilt University and other institutions, we have also a project in which we find that men are more likely, as we know, to tend to want to migrate, typically in the case of Central America, to the US, in comparison to women. However, for example, we find that women who actually report violence against women as a serious problem in their neighborhood express a significantly higher probability of planning to migrate independent of perceived threats from other crimes. And so, like more specifically, we find that women's probability jumps from 21 to 34% on the violence against women scale, closing the gender gap in migration intention. So this is, the effect of fearing violence against women. That one instance in terms of the responses of citizens living in this context is to wanting to migrate. And we know that a lot of governments, including the US, are turning to an approach, right, to deter migration, international migration. However, the evidence shows that a deterrence strategy is unlikely to be effective when those fleeing communities, including women who are turning to international migration at higher rates, and in some contexts even similarly to men, are actually fleeing violence, and this is their last resort. So we can see this environment where not only different forms of violence collude and enhance each other, but with real consequences for these marginalized communities and their residents, including women and girls. I mean, one is resisting in the form of wanting to migrate and actually migrating, but the other is also in trying to seek help and from civil society organizations, which really highlights the importance of civil society in these countries undergoing criminal wars, in not only in Latin America and the Caribbean, but certainly this is a trend worldwide.
Absolutely. And I think the implications for migration, especially within the hemisphere, I think are incredibly clear. And I'd like to talk a bit about that, but I would want to just stay with you for just a moment, because what you're describing really is, it's a gendered issue, but it's also an issue of state security, right? And yet what we know of the context, right, of El Salvador is that women have largely been left out of the policy agenda. Could you talk to us about the missed opportunity, and allow, if there's examples that you can also cite from women's involvement with the civil society organizations in the region, that would be fantastic.
Yeah. Yes, thank you so much for that question. Yes, absolutely. I mean, the higher incidence of gender-based violence in criminal wars is more than a gender issue, for sure. And it's typically treated, more as trying to target social norms related to some cultural, interaction between genders and, the women's role in society. And some of the approaches in terms of responses, because of this very limited view of what is going on, right? That I would say many like scholars and practitioners hold, right? But we have seen a change in that too. I mean, I don't want to discredit all the efforts of feminist scholars and also people like Romania who are trying to change that view, right? That the responses are simple or actually top down. So typically, what we are seeing in terms of responses to an issue that is not simply a gender issue is, for example, trying to increase reporting rates of instances of sexual violence, intimate partner violence. And to give you a concrete example, one of my students currently is studying whether people are aware of an app, in the state of Mexico that is called, Red Naranja, in which you can actually find the phone numbers, and if you feel threatened or you witness gender-based violence. And while those approaches, I mean, they have a lot of problems, not to say that a lot of people don't have access to technology, going back to the idea of, the top-down approach, but also like it really neglects or is insufficient to address the issue of gender-based violence in context of criminal wars or the militarization of public security, because as I mentioned before, to start with, people don't want to report, and particularly, to state institutions. And so, even though those very precise interventions might be beneficial, they are certainly insufficient. And so the findings of my research as a whole carry this very important policy implication that I think is, in a way, not surprising, but I really want to emphasize. And that is that the results of my research suggest that in order to address violence against women in criminal wars and significantly contribute to increasing opportunities for underprivileged women and girls to flourish, a public policy response to organized crime should not only contemplate the provision of specialized services to survivors, but also to enhance public security policies or enact public security policies that are supportive of human rights. So if we have public security policies that violate human rights of everyone, but on top of that, women's safety is not even considered as a issue that deserves special attention, so we are not going to make much progress. In addition, I argue that to press political elites to change their militarized approach to public security, citizens play an important role. Public opinion that is favorable to public security that guarantees the protection of human rights is key I argue for shifting iron fist policies to humane policing strategies. And so really only if the public is willing to condemn militarization and human rights abuses, informed by previous research, I argue that political elites can be inclined to shift their security policy. And what is the mechanism, or why would they want to change? Well, the main idea is that they will lose the support of citizens, right? And so it's in their interest to continue to cultivate that support, and therefore citizens' mobilization and action in favor of victims, survivors, and also attentive to violence against women that condemn, gender-based violence is very important. And I just want to end, this the answer to my question. And I have to say, unfortunately, trying to shift public opinion in favor of human rights protection is not an easy task. So unfortunately, public opinion, in countries like El Salvador and in many other Latin American contexts, they are actually, oftentimes are willing to tolerate and even, even instances of sexual violence, right? Particularly, I actually find in the context of El Salvador, when this sexual violence is in the hands of state armed actors, citizens are more likely to tolerate that type of violence. And so militarization policies really, when they are implemented, they are reinforcing this stigmatization of residents living in neighborhoods marked by organized criminal groups, territorial control, and they are contributing to increased perceptions of criminality. And therefore, like, victims are criminalized, and people have less regard toward those victims, including victims of sexual violence. So the big question here, right, is how can we not only, how can we change public opinion so the population becomes a force for defending human rights in general, and also starts demanding a shift in public policy, particularly on issues of security. And so, like previous work that I have conducted, actually looking at state repression against immigrants, co-authored with a graduate student here at Notre Dame, Nathan Skiing, which showed that actually the implementation of education or media campaigns that disseminate information not only on human rights and the rule of law, but also that make the testimonies of victims visible, can actually generate attitudinal change more favorable to human rights and policies that are actually more favorable to marginalized populations.
Thank you, Abby. Thank you so much. And I think one of the things that I want to shift slightly, because you're talking about really the domestic, right, public policy, bringing in a greater human rights lens into how we're looking at this issue. I did want to take a step back and look internationally, right? And Romina, I'll come to you, because one of the things that Abby raised here is the importance of highlighting, right, the fact that these rights that are being abused when it comes to women and girls facing violence are human rights. But I think there's also a conversation that needs to be had around some of the potential shortcomings, right, of the dominant humanitarian policies and practices when it comes to GBV.
I created this project to translate the research, the community-based research that I produced on domestic violence and faith, and how domestic violence is experienced, and how the clergy in particular could become part of a more organized response. I then translated that into a large international project that works in religio-culturally sensitive ways to respond to domestic violence as one form of gender-based violence in the region. And I was intending to go back to Tigray to translate the research into actual interventions, which I have produced and already implemented in the past 2 years in Ethiopia. However, at the time that I was returning, the war erupted in November 2020, when my project started as well. I was intending to do the first intervention in Tigray. However, we had to move elsewhere. We had to shift the project to Amhara region in the southern Ethiopia, and Oromia region as well. As a result of that, as a result of facing a conflict, we had to then adapt our project as well. We had to make ourselves relevant to the context, right? We couldn't look at domestic violence since there was, reported sexual violence. There's other forms of violence being perpetrated in Tigray, but also other parts of the country. And so we need to make ourselves relevant, because I was leading an impact-oriented research, research and intervention project. And so what we did, we administered a literature review to look at the relationship between domestic violence and political violence. And we were trying to make ourselves relevant to the humanitarian response in Tigray at first stage, because that is where we were based. And so we conducted this literature review, which was interdisciplinary, and we tried to understand what are the connections between intimate partner violence in peacetime and political conflict, but also the consequences of that relationship. And so in parallel to doing the literature review, we tried to then feed that evidence into the humanitarian response. So I joined the GBVAOR community, which is sort of the community of humanitarian actors operating in the country. There is a large email listserv, but also sort of more informal networks and connections. I also advised the British Embassy, the FCDO, sort of the development department of International Development Department here in the UK, and also joined the UK's Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict Initiative, PSVI. Again, I tried to make myself relevant, because the situation was changing and we had to make ourselves relevant. And so that literature review showed that, first, again, there was no religio-cultural sensitivity and contextualization in most humanitarian responses. Those tended to be top-down. When an emergency happens, at least the humanitarian sector doesn't expect it. Those who are locally grounded might have some, understanding of what might happen, but the humanitarian sector is not informed. So it's very top-down. They're trying to figure out how to do things in an integrated and systematic manner. They have to put in place protocols. They have to understand who the actors are. They have to understand what the response mechanism within the country context and then regional context within Ethiopia looks like. And so that knowledge is not there necessarily. Also, they don't have time to conduct research. So they don't have time to, they might have time, but really that's not integrated within the humanitarian response systems that are being implemented today, at least to the extent that I could witness them and sort of understand them. So what I did, I stepped in because I said, look, I've done decolonial, community-grounded anthropological research in the region. At least I can contribute my understanding of the religious and cultural context and help humanitarian actors adapt their approaches, understand the women's initiatives that exist in the community, and ensure that those are integrated, and ensure that they consult with the women's groups, with the women's bureaus or offices that exist in Tigray, across Tigray, at least in peacetime. And that they don't assume that there are no mechanisms in place, right? Because that oftentimes happens. There's this mentality that African countries have a deficit and they don't have organized systems, but they do exist. So I was trying to do that contextualization and translation, cultural translation, cosmological translation in real time. I would also say that, again, religious beliefs were not integrated at all. They were not considered. Once we put out that literature review, which I will come back to in relation to the findings, I noted there very clearly that, again, religious belief systems have to be included because, look, Tigray is 97% Ethiopian Orthodox, and that is a very authoritative, valued tradition for the people. It doesn't matter if people have in-depth theological knowledge, but they do uphold this tradition quite closely. And so the clergy in particular, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church has spiritual father, structure around spiritual fathers. So most couples, most individuals who are attending church, they will have a spiritual father throughout their lives. Not everyone, but it is a norm. And so the clergy could become part of that response system, because usually people, when something happens in their life, they will approach the spiritual father. The clergy are influential. Increasingly, people are judgmental about certain bad clergy, as they call them, but in general, they consider them authoritative because people respect them and respect that they serve in a spiritual capacity that they venerate. So this was an important parameter that had to be considered. And also, the psychosocial responses in particular do not seem to differentiate between society-level communal interventions and more individual psychological or clinical support that might be needed for victims and survivors of conflict-related violence, but also complex trauma. Because again, one of the findings of the literature review was that there is violence in peacetime. We need to understand that. And there is violence in peacetime. And oftentimes that violence happens in the domestic sphere, is normalized, is not identified as such. And so there is trauma accumulated. And also in this case, we should not forget that Tigrayan people had been involved in another war with Eritrea in late 1998. And so there was already accumulated war trauma from a previous war. And that trauma reflected on the domestic sphere and had a relationship with IPV, which was not explored earlier. And of course there's other traumas and other forms of violence and abuse that happen within peacetime in a society, not just in Tigray, across Ethiopia and across the world. So those multiple forms of violence had to be considered, and then a distinction should have been made, a clearer distinction, because again, international humanitarian responses like to use the word psychosocial response, but what does that mean? So I think those need to be differentiated, because there need to be sort of societal community-wide responses to raise awareness and to build community preparedness to support survivors, right? And then there need to be more individual clinical or psychological or counseling responses for survivors and victims that need that. Again, a case management approach that was indeed taken, as I saw in the humanitarian response. And of course, we should acknowledge that humanitarian responses have limited scope. And in Tigray, in this particular case, most of the region was not reached, not reachable in any case. Conflict was ongoing. Of course, that was one parameter. Roads were closed, communication was blocked. So there were multiple parameters that did not allow a humanitarian response across the region. And so people had limited understanding, limited knowledge, very sort of specific to specific regions, but again, across regions, there might be differentials that need to be understood and considered. So again, humanitarian responses have, how can I say, is this, it's an interesting concept. There is a crisis, suddenly this system appears out of nowhere, this response, but that, the actors who are involved in the humanitarian response have not necessarily been there before. They don't understand the context. They don't necessarily speak the languages. Some do, but the majority don't. And so one has to question this approach. Is there a better approach to respond to humanitarian emergencies? I don't question that, and I want to come back to this point a little later, so I won't mention it now, but I don't say that there isn't a role for a humanitarian sort of international actors to respond in such crisis, because the sides can be the conflict can be politicized. And so it may be very difficult for the warring sides to find a solution for multiple reasons. So there has to be an arbitrator, if that makes sense. But then, how should that, is there a more efficient, a more effective, a more transparent, and a more decolonized way of doing that? That's a question that I would put to the audience and you and myself to reflect on. Thank you.
Thanks, Romina. Absolutely. And I think that distinction that you raise, I think, is incredibly important, right? And staying with you for a moment, because I think this is a question that both of you have spoken to and can speak to further, is this question of, so then what sort of happens as people migrate, right? Abby started talking about that in her response. And I think I'd like to talk a little bit, Romina, about the other side of the work that you're doing, right? Is that migration piece. So what happens, right? with the work that you've carried out with Ethiopian migrants and refugees in the UK, can you tell us a bit about the implications, right, on migrants in the diaspora when they're coming from these situations of violence? And I think also, bearing in mind that continuity of violence that you outline, right, the violence that happens during peacetime and the responses that come during times of war or conflict, and then sort of when that disappears, right, when peacetime does come. So if you would talk to us a bit about sort of what happens, right, with the trauma, with the lived experience that then happens with migrants and refugees in the diaspora, and then Abby, I'll come to you.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really important question and a lot to unpack here. I see how I can do this very briefly. I guess that I became interested in looking at those migration paths or pathways and a displacement in particular, because I became very aware of the need to look at violence as a continuum. And this is a feminist contribution, and we need to acknowledge that, that violence should not be seen as a sort of a static point, and, how can I say, as a point in time, really, but really as continuing in different forms, different degrees, and different perpetrators, potentially, but really trying to take a more, as I said, transboundary longitudinal view and approach to the analysis of violence. So this is how I became interested on the one hand to connect what was happening within East Africa and then in the migratory or migration context within the UK as one impetus. The other impetus, as I said, was really to decolonize the knowledge exchange and to learn from the good practices. Oftentimes there are community-based programs within the Ethiopian context that respond to domestic violence in religio-culturally appropriate ways, and they are efficient, but those are not being communicated or reported or used by the international development sector or by Western societies. I've written a piece on decolonizing capacity building, and there is this idea, as I've argued there with my colleague Mario Mormina at Oxford, that we tend to, there's still this idea that non-Western low and middle income countries have a deficit in capacity and that the Western societies have nothing to learn from them. And so we're trying to change that. We're trying to tell the UK in this context and DVA, domestic violence and abuse service providers, that to really understand how to cater to diverse migrant and ethnic minority groups, they need to understand sort of the worldviews they come from, the normative systems they bring with them. And of course, I plan to make some points on this. A lot changes in the host society, right? So in interaction with more secular gender systems, with new realities, but a lot of the norms and the sociocultural ideals and expectations, especially the societal pressures, continue in the host society. And this is because a lot of communities in migration stay together or become closer as a way of belonging in what might seem alienating secular or Western or society that is different from what they might be used to. So this is really the two sort of points of view or stimuli that led me to this sort of research. Now, what we're doing in the UK currently is to, first and foremost, I wanted to make a distinction, sorry, Nyeleti, because we sort of talk about refugees sometimes and sometimes about migrants. And of course, these are different categories in a way, because there isn't really a universal definition for migrants, but they can be economic migrants, students, international students such as myself, not necessarily, not people who flee because of political violence, because they have to in order to save their lives, which is what the term refugee would primarily refer to. So I wanted to make that distinction. In our research, we engage primarily with migrant communities in the UK, so communities that have been in the UK, it could be they might have arrived recently, but they may have lived there for generations. They might have British nationality too, but also again, those groups and the samples that we engage with might actually include refugees or people who have been asylum seekers and have been settled now, so have been granted their asylum request. So I just wanted to make that differentiation, because again, then these different groups would have different levels of vulnerability. And the other point I wanted to make is that migrant communities are not necessarily more, they don't have a higher frequency of IPV necessarily, but they do have more vulnerabilities in relation to migration factors that would then make them vulnerable to domestic violence and other forms of gender-based violence. So those could be that they do not trust statutory services in the host society, and again, this might be informed by their experiences with statutory services or state services back home, which goes back to previous point made earlier, and other factors. It could be racializing or racism that they perceive and experience in the home society, and multiple other factors that might lead members of migrant communities to not make use of services, in this case domestic violence services, and might deter them from seeking support. So again, that means that the issue exists, but is not being resolved. And just to make a point that what I've noticed, because I did some ethnographic research in Ethiopian and Eritrean Orthodox churches in the UK, in London, oftentimes in the migration context, which again could include refugees, right, people who are displaced and without their will, because they had to, people in migration oftentimes will seek religious spaces because and I've had participants who have told me that they became more religious in the host society context because they felt that in that new context they needed something to identify with their community back home. They might feel again alone or lonely, and it's a way of their relationship with God, their relationship, their spirituality can be a coping mechanism. But again, it's important to recognize that there is a lot of change that happens with migration and displacement and change, but also again a lot of normative pressures continue and are there to influence people's behaviors and attitudes. And I think it's important to have a nuanced approach to this, and not to stereotype or generalize people, and understand the contextual differentials and parameters. So this is really where I'm coming from. I want to promote a more transboundary way of looking at domestic violence and understanding how those norms continue or change, and how, in particular, religious beliefs, because I'm coming from that, I'm a scholar of religions, could become a resource, because oftentimes they're part of the problem. Of course, I can talk about it later, but they could become a resource too, including the clergy and the religious teachers.
Thanks so much.
I think I'll stop here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I wanted to pick something up just before we go over to our questions. I see a number of questions from the audience, and I want to make sure that we engage with those who are with us today. I would just, Romina, if I could give you one last question before we switch over, which is picking up a little bit on what Romina talked about shifting those social norms, right? We've been talking about shifting narratives today. We've been talking about shifting public policy. We've been talking about shifting or building upon, right, what we see as some of the humanitarian responses. But I wanted to go back, Abby, to something that you'd mentioned earlier in the conversation around how we can change social norms, right, to allow for greater protections for women. So if you would talk a bit about that, and then I'll go ahead and open it up to the chat from the audience.
Yes, thank you so much for the question. I think to answer that question is important to really focus on what we are seeing across the world, that is, to show how challenging it is to change citizens' attitudes and behaviors. And that is, we have to account for a context of democratic erosion that the world is experiencing in the region of the world that I study, Latin America in particular. We have seen the emergence of authoritarian regimes. And so with the support actually, right, of the population. And so this is critical, to understand how we can change attitudes and behaviors among citizens, because a lot of the political leaders that have been elected through elections, and you know, people voting at relatively high rates and supporting those leaders, is precisely because citizens have been supporting their approach to public security that relies on the military. And so in a context where citizens really support the militarization of public policy, you know, the question becomes, how can we change citizens' views about it so that they're also change and lower their support to state militarization. And so I think it's you know, we are facing this larger question of how can we actually promote citizen support for human rights and policies that support the rights of men and women and gender minorities. And so given that, so the, you know, the answer to this question is not only that we need to change norms regarding gender, which obviously is very important, but also changing citizens' views about governments and you know, what a democratic government is and is supposed to do for the population at large. And so that said, you know, in practice, because the support that citizens have been given to these types of government that rely on iron fist policies, we don't see an agenda on violence against women to be central, you know, in the public discourse of political elites. And, you know, it's not only that these new elected governments or governments, you know, that rely on iron fist policy are not building on previous efforts to address violence against women, but actually are dismantling systems that were there, that at least, you know, were giving some hope of increasing attention to survivors, for example. And the real, you know, way that we see it is we have seen lower budgets to initiatives on violence against women responses. So, and citizens actually, and based on the survey data that I have, you know, they definitely prefer to invest more in the militarization of public security than spending, you know, a larger portion of the budget on issues related to gender-based violence. And so given this general trend, changing attitudes toward gender-based violence and the approach, you know, that the state has to have is difficult, as I said, first, because citizens see the victims as probably related to, you know, criminal activity, particularly when they live in these controlled territories. So we see this criminalization of marginalized communities, in part because the militarization policy is reinforcing those views. And so, as I mentioned before, one of the ways to address the issue is to really continue the work, and I say the work of civil society organizations in really denouncing human rights abuses in general to people of all genders, and raising awareness. You know, in my fieldwork experience, like most civil society organizations are actually implementing one way or the other campaigns or education programs, not only to change gender norms, but also to increase the salience of the importance of respecting human rights. And so one venue is to really continue doing research on what are the best practices to disseminate information to the public via social media or other means with education programs, to really educate the public that what we are seeing first is not democratic, because, you know, also there is all this confusion of how democracy looks like, and whether, you know, if a leader has the support of most people, that's you know, seen as democratic, and that actually has empowered leaders to implement any kind of policies as a mandate from the public, right? So citizens need to have, you know, a better sense of what democracy actually entails, and also be supportive of human rights. And I do think that, again, civil society organizations, with the accompaniment of international organizations, are actually working toward that goal in terms of actual interventions that might work to change citizens' attitudes and behaviors. As I mentioned before, some of my co-author research points to the importance of disseminating information about human rights and the rule of law, but also, and I will say even more importantly, to visualize, the human rights atrocities through the testimonies of those who have suffered those types of crimes. And so when you disseminate that type of information, you do see a shift. And, you know, it's part of the research agenda that we are also here developing at Notre Dame. However, there is another mechanism that, you know, in a way, is an unintended effect of militarization policies that you see that citizens are starting to see that militarization is not the path. And that is that as many people start to see that they know someone, for example, in the context of El Salvador, that, you know, who has been incarcerated in an unjustified way, or, you know, when instances of they know someone who has been sexually harassed, you know, by members of, the police or the military. So as the policy it starts to be more and more aggressive, many more people either themselves or know someone who has suffered this type of abuse. And so the unintended consequence is that citizens in that way, unfortunately, the hard way, you know, they are starting to see that militarization is not the solution. Thank you so much, Nyeleti.
Thanks, Abby. Thank you so much. So I want to go over now to the chat, where we have a number of questions that have been posed. In an effort to make sure that we get to all of them, I might put some of them together, but I think I'll start with two questions here that are quite similar, that are looking at or asking around sort of the role of international organizations like the United Nations, right? So Ezekiel Nyabenda talks about what the role of the UN is in curbing violence, as sort of violence against women can be deeply entrenched in the world's socio-political economic systems, and how these are sort of endorsed by governments. Similarly, Abebe Tesfa, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, highlights that last week the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission reported more than 200 women, including nurses, that have been sexually assaulted and have had, you know, other sorts of gender-based violence committed against them, and sort of talking about, you know, how we might be lobbying international community to hold such crimes, right? So if you would talk to the role of these international organizations, and maybe Romina, I'll start with you. Abby, if you'd then like to jump in.
Thank you so much for both questions. Excellent. That's the question. It's really at the heart of the conversation, where it should be at the heart of the conversation. I mean, I think I would agree with some commentators that the UN really has run its course. It's, you know, I think it's trying to make itself relevant, but it has become a pathological institution. I like this term. It's a term used in political science, whereby it sort of aims to maintain its existence. But the aim that it was set up to serve, I mean, it really was set up after the World War II, right? And to maintain security and peace and so on. But the thing is that it has become so highly politicized and political that you know, there have been historical examples that have shown its limited effect, really. You know, when we think about the Cold War dynamics, right, with many taking the side of the Soviet Union, others taking the side of the US, and that halting what the UN could do in that period, right? And it shows again how politics dominate the voting system and, you know, everything that the UN does. Again, I'm not going to pretend that I know the UN from the inside out. It's a very complex institution of multiple agencies, and I think that different agencies do different things, and some agencies have better practices than others. So I want to make that differentiation. But I do believe that there has to be some reflection, because there is a double standard, right? If I could name it that way. I mean, I looked at the Ethiopian and the Ukraine crisis happened, well, at some point in parallel. The Ethiopian crisis started earlier, the Ukraine crisis a year later, I think. When was it? And there was a time when they were happening in parallel. I was in Ethiopia, and I remember that there was so much outspoken, the US in particular, the UN representatives were very outspoken about the sexual violence in Tigray, but very outspoken about the sexual violence in Ukraine, which was reported to a much lower degree at the time than it had been in Tigray region, because again, we were getting reports of extensive systematic sexual violence against women and girls in Tigray, perpetrated by the militants, the militant groups. And so it was striking to me how the Ukraine crisis suddenly got so much attention immediately, because it served the politics of the Western societies against Russia, but the sexual violence in Tigray in East Africa was getting very little attention. And so now I'm editing a volume about the two conflicts, where I'm trying to juxtapose the two and really sort of decolonize that double standard in how different conflicts are being prioritized or not, right? Not only by the UN, but by the international community in general, and international observers. So I think there definitely is there has to be some reflection of how the voting system or the political representation within the UN serves or not its purposes, and really a reflection of what are its purposes and aims nowadays, and what can the UN contribute that is really needed and that nobody else does, if that makes sense. And the other comment I wanted to make is, look, I was in Tigray, and this is a highly politicized, controversial conflict, because there were two warring sides within Ethiopia with Eritrean involvement, and so it got out of hand very quickly. And I'm not going to take up political sides here, but it became highly politicized. And so people like me, who had given their lives to decolonize international development and to really give voices to communities, suddenly became silenced. Why? Because I'm white and external. And if you try to speak about the crimes that were being perpetrated in Tigray and in other parts of Ethiopia, you are suddenly a colonizer. And so it was irony, it was ironic, because I spent all my life having come from the Soviet Union and having seen violence, violence, not seen it myself, but having seen the consequences of violence for our communities. And suddenly I was silenced. And so I wanted to show how the dynamics of conflict make it very difficult for us who are grounded locally to speak out safely and without repercussions. Because when we do speak out, we can be named all sorts of things, and suddenly we're invalidated. And there is a big question there. In an era of decolonization, how can we call out crimes in a way that people will accept, right? But also standing for human rights and standing for humanity first, and the survivors and the victims. I struggle with that question, because I felt that I couldn't speak in that context. And I take this opportunity to speak more, I guess. But I always struggle with that question. Could have I done more? What was the right approach? Thank you.
Thank you, Romina. Thank you for that. And again, I think those questions of the positionality of the researcher, I think also in terms of what we prioritize, right? Whose pain we prioritize, what the political agendas internationally are when it comes to situations of violence, and we see that the world over. So thank you for raising that question. I think important both for research and for policy. Abby, please, if you'd like to add to this question before we move on.
Yeah, just briefly, I mean, when we think about, the UN and its role, I mean, I would say definitely is a critical actor, right, that we need to engage with, and being mindful, of course, of this, avoiding this top-down approach. However, I mean, when I think specifically about gender-based violence, and, even more, I would say delimited to violence against women and girls, I'm thinking about UN Women. So the UN is a large entity. And so when we think about what's the role of the UN, I think we have to think about what's the role of all the different divisions within the UN. And so thinking about the role of UN women, what I have seen in practice, actually, I just came back, from El Salvador, like 3 or 2 weeks ago, to work with the UN women in El Salvador, but also, being in touch with UN women in general. And I think they are playing a very important role in coordinating with civil society organizations on the ground and bringing the different actors, including governments, to the table, not only to really emphasize, how large of a problem it is, like gender-based violence, but also the implications not only for women, but for society as a whole. So I have seen this in action, and I think this coordination and really accompaniment of civil society organizations, including faith-based, to me, has been very hopeful, give me hope that there is still not only there is hope, and there is a way that we can continue these efforts that, bring together different actors. And I would say in this case, being led by UN women specifically. And so in context of, again, democratic erosion, international organizations and UN women in particular, if we think about gender-based violence, is really critical, because I think it can bring the different actors, again, including government. And so not only is supporting specific efforts that are proposed from civil society, but speak directly to government officials. And sometimes that capacity, is very limited when from the point of view of civil society organizations, when they are perceived by government as the enemy, right, or really the opposition. So I think, now more than ever, I would say international actors and the different sectors of the UN definitely have a role to play in all these crises that we are seeing. And on the topic of gender-based violence, UN women, I would say is key. And to me, importantly, the different actors also involve academics, not only local institutions, academic institutions, but international. To me, it's important not only to work with local civil society organizations, but also with entities like UN Women, in which, we all together, based on research, come up with courses of action. And to that, point, Notre Dame, as part of the new lab by Keough, on justice and violence against women, we just actually signed a memorandum of understanding with UN Women El Salvador, because I think that's also a responsibility for us academics, that, even if, yes, we are not necessarily on the ground, but the need to actually reach out to partners and be on the ground as much as we can has become crucial, because our research, can only be useful if we are speaking to multiple sectors and actors. So thank you.
Thank you, Abby. And I'm just looking at the time here, and I want to make sure that we get as many questions answered as possible. So perhaps what I'll do is I'll pose one question to each of you, and then allow you to answer in quick succession. So Romina, for you, there's a question here around the idea of decolonizing the approaches to GBV. There's someone who's really interested in trying to understand, how do we meaningfully integrate embedded cultural norms, such as the accepted roles and responsibilities between men and women in many communities, which has served to unite them into policy and research design. So Romina, if you would talk a little bit more about decolonialism in terms of our research and policy designs. And then Abby, there's a question that's coming up again and again. It has to do with state legitimacy, but also around questions, a number of people are interested in sort of the normalization and acceptance of violence against women in certain, in many societies. societies, right? And so how this is justified, right? Especially among citizens in Latin America, it seems, from Jose Catito, I hope I'm saying that correctly. So how does this relate to sort of the greater involvement of women in drug networks? And are women sort of blamed by the population? Are they protected? So if you would speak to that, Romina, after Abby, and Romina, you please go ahead and speak to the decolonization question.
Yes, that needs a bit of reflection. It's a very good question. There's multiple ways, I guess. There's the way that we have taken, and I'm not saying that, I guess what I'm trying to say is we are doing our best to be to work by a decolonial ethos, but decolonization is an effort and an ongoing process. There isn't a telos where you think that you are being decolonial or it's working. You're doing your best. One of the ways we do that is by working collaboratively and co-producing our interventions, both our research. So we have research, intervention, and public engagement, where we share that research to inform policy, to raise awareness in the public, to educate, and so on. So three sort of arms or activities, let's say. We co-produce all these different activities with partners within the societies that we work in and the communities that we work in. So for instance, we delivered an intervention based on a manual that I designed to train Ethiopian Orthodox clergy on domestic violence, based on the research that I had completed and other engagements with clergy in other regions of Ethiopia, Amhara, Oromia, and so on, in between 2016 and 2021. And that manual not only integrated ethnographic research that allowed those who were being trained and engaging with the manual and the training material to understand the context based on research and through the voices of real people in the community, right? But also it was using religious teachings, theological material that I had developed through many years in cooperation with theological colleges in Ethiopia, to develop theological material that is authoritative, that is embedded in the local exegetical and theological tradition of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and that responded directly to issues around gender relations, equality, let's say the verse about wife submission, right? Or about male headship. There's a lot of sort of, I wouldn't say misinterpretation, but it's oftentimes very enculturated ideas of what those teachings mean. People have inherited certain notions and they don't necessarily question whether these are accurate theological teachings. And so that material was very much informed by research with the community, with laity and clergy in the community. And when we train the clergy, we show to them what the clergy in the community are teaching so that they see themselves their shortfalls and gaps, or positive approaches that they might use in responding to these issues in the community. So again, one way of decolonizing is to work through co-creation and co-production with partners and organizations and community-based grassroots initiatives that are already embedded and trusted. For this initiative, we work with the development wing of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, with EUTC DICAG. So they are trusted. They already have a mechanism in place, right? So that avoids duplication. So again, it's not just about the research, which is important and has to happen before to inform interventions, but it's also who are we doing these interventions with, right? And what is the infrastructure and the mechanism through which these interventions are being implemented. So it's about contextualization, really. Some people in international development call it localization. I don't really like that term for various reasons that I won't go into right now, but I do believe it's understanding who the actors are, what the resources are, what the issues are, and how communities experience those issues. And really taking a nuanced approach, right? Not stereotyping or generalizing on the basis of what we assume are the problems, but discovering those, exploring those through the stories of the communities and those involved.
Thank you, Romina. Abby, please.
Yes, and I'm mindful of the time. So let me just say that gender norms in general really affect not only like the responses of citizens to gender-based violence, but also the way that criminal organizations instrumentalize gender-based violence, and more specifically, I find actually in my research that people in general tend to perceive women as less likely to commit crimes. And so what I see that actually that does is that organized criminal organizations therefore turn to women and use their labor, given that they are less likely to be seen as suspicious of committing a crime, and engage a lot of women in, for example, charging extortion. So these gender norms, even when they seem benevolent, right, like perceiving women as less likely to commit a crime, actually has led to the victimization of women by criminal organizations, precisely because they are seen as an asset to commit crimes and kind of being perceived as low-key and less likely to be caught. And the other way that we see gender norms to play out, as I mentioned before, is that people in general, have these ingrained sexist attitudes. However, what I find is that when sexual violence, for example, occurs in territories that are marked by the territorial control by criminal organizations, and the crime occur in the hands of police and military, then citizens are even more willing, to tolerate violence against women, which is a clear problem. So I have way more to say, but I leave it there, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, there's nothing more to do but to thank you both for leading us in such a rich conversation, in a discussion that recognized and complicated the feminist GBV paradigm, that noted the importance of shifting cultural and public norms at the local and international level, and that really concretized for many of us the ways in which we can engage in mitigating the problem of gender-based violence in a decolonial way. So of course, this conversation could have continued for several more hours, but I do have the duty of bringing us to a close. I'd like to just tease our next session in this series of 3 conversations, which is Reckoning with Intimate Partner Violence After the Pandemic. It'll take place on November 28th. It'll delve into more of what we've started to discuss today, but we'll also look at what was called the shadow pandemic, right, during the COVID-19 pandemic, of how really intimate partner violence rose steadily, and what some of the impacts, right, of what we saw during COVID are now in our post-COVID world, if we can call it that. So I'd like to draw your attention to the chat. If you haven't yet signed up, please do register using the link that is in the chat there. I'd like to thank you all for being in attendance, and especially those of you who have stayed with us to the end. As I mentioned, this recording will be made available on the Foundation's website, hfg.org. We also encourage you to follow us on our social media platforms and to get more information about upcoming events, publications, grants, and other funding opportunities. You can follow us on Twitter at HF Guggenheim, and on Facebook and LinkedIn at Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you at the next installment of HFG's Knowledge Against Violence speaker series.
Thank you so much, Nyeleti. Thank you, Abby. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you for having us.